The financial pattern. Introduction. Most people track effort. They track hours, stress, sacrifice, and intention. They rarely track outcomes over time. If you want to understand your financial situation, ignore how hard you've worked and look at the results themselves. Not once, not emotionally, but across years. When you do that, something becomes visible that is easy to miss while you're busy. Repetition. Income changes in small ways, but it doesn't escape a certain range. Circumstances shift, but the overall level remains familiar. There may be progress, setbacks, recovery, but the pattern stays intact. This repetition is not obvious because it feels normal. Normal doesn't trigger an alarm. It doesn't demand explanation. It simply becomes background. Earl Nightingale paid attention to this when others didn't. He wasn't interested in individual stories or temporary changes. He was interested in consistency because consistency points to cause. Repeat. Something upstream must also be repeating. Most people assume that trying harder is upstream. It isn't. Effort is downstream. It's a response to internal conditions, not their source. You can increase effort without changing direction. When that happens, you don't create new outcomes. You stabilize existing ones. This is why people can work longer hours and still feel financially stuck. They are applying more force to the same internal settings. Nightingale observed that people rarely question the thoughts they return to daily. Not the thoughts they admire or agree with, but the ones they default to. What feels reasonable to charge? What feels safe to risk? What feels realistic to expect? And these judgments happen quickly, without deliberation. They don't announce themselves as beliefs. They present themselves as common sense. But common sense is often just familiar thinking that has never been challenged. When the same assumptions are repeated, the same decisions follow. When the same decisions follow, behavior stays consistent. And consistent behavior produces consistent results. This is not a theory, it's mechanical. People are not trapped by a lack of opportunity. They are constrained by internal reference points, invisible limits that define what feels acceptable long before a choice is made. Because of this, most financial ceilings are not experienced as barriers. They are experienced as comfort zones. Not comfortable, but familiar enough to feel unavoidable. That familiarity is what makes the pattern hard to see. And what you don't see, you don't change. Nightingale never suggested that people are punished for thinking incorrectly. He suggested something far more neutral. Repetition produces form. Whatever thought patterns dominate, they shape behavior. Whatever behavior repeats, shapes results. The mistake most people make is trying to change results directly. They change tactics, environments, or goals, while leaving the underlying repetition untouched. When that happens, the system corrects itself. Results drift back to the same level, regardless of effort. Until repetition is addressed, progress remains fragile, temporary, reversible. This is why financial change feels exhausting for so many people. They are pushing against a mechanism they haven't identified, and you cannot correct a pattern you refuse to measure. The rest of this audiobook is not about motivation or belief in abundance. It is about identifying the repetition that is already shaping your financial life, whether you agree with it or not. Because once repetition is made visible, it stops being invisible. And once it stops being invisible, it becomes adjustable. That is where change actually begins. Chapter 1. Repetition is the real currency. Earl Nightingale's most quoted line is also his most misunderstood. When he said that we become what we think about, many people assumed he was talking about desire, imagination, or optimism. He wasn't. He was talking about repetition, not what passes through the mind occasionally, but what settles there and returns again and again. A single thought has no power, even a good one, even a true one. Thoughts only begin to shape outcomes when they repeat often enough to become familiar. Familiarity is what gives a thought authority. Authority is what allows it to influence behavior without resistance. This is why people can read books, attend seminars, or experience moments of insight without any lasting financial change. New ideas appear briefly, but they don't replace the existing pattern. They visit, then leave. The old thoughts remain in place because they are rehearsed daily. Rehearsal is what matters. Nightingale understood that repetition functions like currency in the mind. The ideas you spend every day determine what you can afford to believe, attempt, or tolerate. When the same internal dialogue is repeated, it doesn't feel like programming. It feels like reality. This is where many people become confused. They assume their financial limits are based on external facts, the economy, their education, their industry, their background. But these factors only matter insofar as they are interpreted through thought. Two people can face the same conditions and respond in completely different ways, not because of talent, but because their thinking has been conditioned differently over time. Conditioned thinking doesn't argue, it doesn't debate, it doesn't present itself as an opinion. It presents itself as a conclusion. That is its power. When someone says, "That's just how things are," what they usually mean is, "That's how I've learned to think about this." The repetition has already occurred. The decision has already been made. Conscious thought arrives too late to intervene. This is why Nightingale placed so much emphasis on dominant thoughts. Dominant does not mean intense, it means frequently. Quiet thoughts, repeated over long periods, shape behavior far more effectively than dramatic moments of inspiration. Consider how most financial decisions are made, not with calculation, but with feeling. A sense of hesitation, a sense of certainty, a sense of discomfort. These sensations feel instinctive, but they are learned responses. They are the result of past repetition, not present logic. People often say they want more money, but what they really want is relief from pressure or uncertainty. When faced with a choice that threatens their internal sense of stability, they retreat, not consciously, automatically. This is where repetition exerts control. It defines the internal range of what feels acceptable. Anything outside that range triggers resistance, regardless of whether it makes sense on paper. Nightingale never claimed that thoughts create money directly. He claimed something far more precise. Thoughts create behavior, and behavior creates income. When thinking is repetitive, behavior stabilizes. When behavior stabilizes, results repeat. This is why intelligence alone does not lead to financial growth. Smart people repeat the same internal narratives as everyone else. Knowledge does not override conditioning. Conditioning overrides knowledge. This also explains why people often sabotage progress after brief success. When results exceed the internal reference point, discomfort appears. The person doesn't think, "This exceeds my conditioning." They think, "Something feels off." And they correct it. They spend impulsively, they lose focus, they disengage, they create unnecessary problems. The system rebalances itself back to what feels familiar. From the outside, this looks like bad luck or poor discipline. From the inside, it feels like relief. This is not a flaw in character, it is the predictable outcome of repetition. The mind is designed to maintain coherence. It resists sudden changes that threaten its established structure. Nightingale understood this and warned against relying on bursts of enthusiasm. Enthusiasm does not reprogram repetition. It competes with it briefly, then fades. Repetition wins because it is quiet and constant. It doesn't need belief, it only needs time. This is why financial change is not about introducing better ideas, but about displacing old ones. A new thought must appear often enough to challenge the existing pattern, not aggressively, consistently. Most people underestimate how often their internal dialogue repeats the same limitations. They don't hear it because it sounds like their own voice. It feels like reason. It feels like caution. It feels like maturity. But what feels reasonable is often just what has been rehearsed longest. Nightingale's contribution was not optimism. It was a diagnosis. He identified repetition as the governing force behind results and removed morality from the equation. There is no punishment, no reward, only cause and effect. The financial outcomes people experience are not judgments. They are feedback about what has been repeated long enough to become a behavior. Until this is understood, people continue to search for external solutions, new methods, new environments, new systems. All of them can help, but none of them override repetition on their own. Repetition is the real currency, and most people are spending it without awareness. Once that becomes clear, financial change stops being mysterious. It becomes mechanical, and what is mechanical can be adjusted slowly and deliberately. That adjustment does not begin with action. It begins with noticing what you are already repeating, because nothing changes until repetition changes. Chapter 2. Why effort fails to break financial ceilings. Effort is the most trusted tool people use to change their financial situation. When results disappoint, the instinctive response is to push harder, work longer, learn more, stay busy. This response feels responsible, it feels virtuous, it feels logical. It is also why financial ceilings remain intact. Earl Nightingale was careful to separate effort from direction. Effort amplifies whatever system it is applied to. If the internal system is unchanged, effort does not produce transformation, it produces stabilization. This is difficult to accept because effort is visible. Thinking is not. Effort can be measured, praised, and rewarded socially. Internal repetition cannot. As a result, people overvalue effort and undervalue calibration. When effort increases without a change in internal reference points, one of two things happens. Either results remain flat or they improve briefly and then regress. In both cases, the ceiling holds. This creates a specific kind of frustration. People feel they are doing everything right and still not moving forward. They interpret this as unfairness or bad timing. Nightingale interpreted it as misapplied force. Effort operates downstream. It expresses decisions that have already been made internally. You cannot outwork an internal limit because effort takes its instructions from that limit. Consider how people decide what opportunities to pursue. The decision rarely begins with analysis. It begins with a feeling, interest, resistance, anxiety, indifference. These reactions occur before conscious evaluation. By the time effort is applied, the direction has already been selected. This is why people can be highly productive and still stagnant. Productivity does not guarantee progress, it guarantees output. Progress requires alignment between effort and internal permission. Nightingale often warned against confusing movement with advancement. Movement is easy to create. Advancement requires a change in internal orientation. Without that change, effort circulates within a closed system. A closed system can work harder indefinitely without expanding. This is why financial ceilings feel invisible. They are not encountered as walls, they are encountered as preferences. What someone chooses to pursue, avoid, negotiate, or delay feels personal. It feels chosen. In reality, it is conditioned. Effort reinforces this conditioning by repeatedly acting it out. Every time a person applies effort within the same internal limits, those limits become more entrenched. The mind learns that this range is safe, familiar, proven. Breaking a ceiling would require behaving outside that range. That behavior would feel uncomfortable, irresponsible, or premature. Not because it is, but because it violates repetition. This is where effort becomes counterproductive. The more a person strains within the same framework, the more convincing that framework feels. Exhaustion is mistaken for proof. Nightingale observed that many people use effort to avoid confronting thinking. Working harder feels safer than examining assumptions. It preserves identity. It allows someone to say, "I'm doing my part," without questioning the internal rules governing what my part is allowed to be. This is why advice that emphasizes hustle resonates emotionally but fails structurally. It validates effort while leaving the mechanism untouched. Effort can increase income temporarily by intensifying existing behaviors. Overtime, side work, short-term pushes. But temporary increases do not dismantle ceilings, they test them. When the internal reference point is exceeded, stress appears. Not excitement, stress. The person does not experience expansion as freedom. They experience it as instability. And instability triggers correction. Correction does not require conscious intent. The system adjusts automatically, focus slips, discipline weakens, new problems appear. The person tells themselves a story about why things didn't last. From the outside, this looks like an inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like relief. This is why Nightingale rejected the idea that success is about working harder than others. Many people work extremely hard and never escape their range. Hard work explains fatigue. It does not explain the results. Results follow the structure. Effort without structural change is like increasing speed without changing direction. You cover more ground, but you end up in the same place. This is the uncomfortable implication of Nightingale's work. It suggests that effort is not the lever people think it is. It is secondary, necessary, but subordinate. The primary lever is internal calibration. What feels acceptable? What feels realistic? What feels like too much? Until those internal measurements shift, effort can only express what is already permitted. This is why people often feel that something always pulls them back. They are not being pulled. They are returning. The system is self-correcting. Understanding this removes blame. It also removes false hope. The answer is not to push harder against the ceiling. The answer is to question why the ceiling feels normal in the first place. Nightingale believed that once this question is asked seriously, effort stops being wasted. It becomes precise, directed, economical. But until then, effort remains the most expensive way to maintain the status quo. The ceiling does not break under force. It dissolves when the thinking that supports it is no longer repeated. That is why effort alone has never been enough. Chapter 3: The Internal Reference Point. Every person carries an internal reference point for money. It is not written down, it is rarely spoken of. Most people are not even aware it exists, and yet it quietly determines what feels acceptable long before any decision is made. This reference point is not a goal. It is not what someone hopes for or dreams about. It is the level of income, stability, and financial pressure that feels normal, not comfortable. Normal is deceptive because it doesn't announce itself as a limit. It feels like realism. It feels like maturity. It feels like knowing one's place in the world. Earl Nightingale understood that people do not rise or fall randomly. They oscillate around this internal setting. When income drops below it, urgency appears. When income rises above it, tension appears. In both cases, behavior adjusts until the familiar level is restored. This is why financial lives often look cyclical rather than progressive. There are advances and setbacks, but they revolve around the same center. The reference point acts like gravity. Most people assume gravity is external. They blame markets, employers, systems, or timing. Nightingale placed gravity internally, not as a judgment, but as a mechanism. The internal reference point is formed early and reinforced slowly. It is shaped by observation long before reasoning develops. What people saw, modeled. What they heard was repeated. What was treated as possible, dangerous, admirable, or irresponsible. Over time, these impressions settle into an unspoken sense of this is about right. Once installed, the reference point does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply reacts. When an opportunity appears above that level, the reaction is rarely excitement. It is hesitation, rationalization, delay, a sense that something is off. People tell themselves they are being cautious. In reality, they are defending familiarity. This is why financial ceilings do not feel like ceilings. They feel like personal preferences. Someone might say they don't want more responsibility, more stress, more exposure. These statements sound reasonable. They are often socially praised. But what is being defended is not peace. It is the reference point. Nightingale observed that people rarely ask why certain numbers feel safe while others feel unrealistic. They treat the feeling as evidence. If it feels unrealistic, it must be unrealistic. This is how internal limits become invisible. They are experienced through intuition. The reference point also explains why sudden financial gains often disappear. When income increases faster than the reference point adjusts, internal conflict arises. The person does not consciously reject success. They unconsciously correct it. They loosen the structure. They stop paying attention. They make decisions they would not normally make. They revert to habits that feel grounding. From the outside, it looks like self-sabotage. From the inside, it feels like returning to balance. The mind values coherence over progress. It prefers familiar struggle to unfamiliar stability. That preference is not emotional. Nightingale did not frame this as fear of success. He framed it as conditioning. The mind protects what it recognizes. This is why people often say they are not money-driven or that they value simplicity. These may be sincere values, but they can also function as rationalizations for unexamined limits. The reference point does not require justification. It only requires repetition. Once established, it filters perception automatically. Opportunities are not evaluated objectively. They are evaluated relative to the reference point. Anything too far outside the range is dismissed before logic engages. This is why advice alone does not work. You cannot reason someone out of a reference point they did not reason themselves into. Nightingale believed that awareness was the first disruption. Once someone notices that their reactions are consistent rather than situational, the reference point becomes visible, and what becomes visible can be adjusted, but adjustment does not happen through force. Trying to override the reference point creates resistance. The system tightens. Adjustment happens through gradual recalibration, repeated exposure to new standards, new norms, new definitions of what is acceptable. This is slow work, which is why most people avoid it. They would rather change circumstances than confront internal calibration. Circumstances feel external. Calibration feels personal. But Nightingale was clear. Circumstances rearrange themselves around the reference point, always. Until the reference point shifts, gains remain temporary and losses feel inevitable. This is not a statement of limitation, it is a statement of precision. Once the internal reference point is understood, financial behavior stops feeling mysterious. Patterns that once felt like bad luck begin to make sense, and responsibility becomes neutral rather than heavy. You are not failing to push past a ceiling. You are returning to a level that has been rehearsed. The work, then, is not to force expansion, but to redefine normal. And that begins by noticing what you instinctively return to when pressure rises or opportunity appears. That is the reference point, and it is doing far more work in your financial life than effort ever has. Chapter 4. Decisions you never decide. Most people believe they make financial decisions consciously. They imagine a moment of choice, a weighing of options, a deliberate conclusion. In reality, most financial decisions are already made before conscious thought arrives. Earl Nightingale understood this and treated it as a central problem, not a philosophical one. He observed that what people call decisions are often just reactions that feel personal. A genuine decision requires evaluation. Most financial responses do not involve evaluation. They involve recognition. Something feels right, wrong, risky, or premature almost instantly. The mind labels this reaction as intuition, common sense, or experience. Then logic is brought in afterward to justify it. This sequence matters. If logic arrives after the reaction, it is not guiding behavior. It explains behavior that has already been selected. This is why people often feel certain without knowing why. They say things like, "I just know," or "it doesn't sit right with me." These statements sound wise. Sometimes they are. Often they are simply conditioned responses repeating themselves. Nightingale pointed out that repeated thoughts create reflexes. Once a thought pattern has been rehearsed long enough, it no longer needs conscious approval. It triggers action automatically. This is how internal limits operate without resistance. Consider how quickly people decide what they can afford, what they are worth, or what they should charge. These judgments appear instantly. They do not emerge from calculation. They emerge from memory, from repetition. The mind compares the present moment to past conditioning and responds accordingly. This is why two people can be offered the same opportunity and respond in opposite ways. One leans in, the other pulls back. Both believe they are being rational. Both are obeying different internal programs. These programs were not chosen, they were absorbed. Most people underestimate how early these patterns are installed. Long before someone understands money, they absorb attitudes toward it. Tension, scarcity, caution, optimism, avoidance. These impressions accumulate quietly. By adulthood, the program is already running. This is what makes financial change so difficult. People try to alter outcomes while obeying the same internal commands. They tell themselves they are choosing differently, but the range of choices they consider acceptable has not changed. This creates the illusion of choice without actual freedom. Nightingale did not frame this as manipulation or control. He framed it as efficiency. The mind automates what it repeats. Automation saves energy. It reduces friction. It creates predictability. The problem is not that automation exists. The problem is that most people never audit what has been automated. As a result, they spend years deciding within the same narrow range. New information enters the system, but it is filtered through old assumptions. The conclusion changes slightly. The trajectory does not. This is why financial advice often feels irrelevant. It conflicts with internal programming. The advice is heard, understood, even agreed with, but not acted upon. Action does not follow agreement, it follows permission. Permission is granted by the internal program, not by logic. Nightingale emphasized that until people recognize this, they will continue to feel conflicted. They will want change while resisting it at the same time. They will mistake hesitation for wisdom and familiarity for safety. This conflict is exhausting. It creates the sense of being stuck without understanding why. People often describe this as self-doubt or lack of confidence. Nightingale described it differently. He saw it as obedience. The mind obeys what has been repeated, nothing more, nothing less. This is why motivation fails. Motivation attempts to override automation through emotion. Automation waits until the emotion fades, then resumes control. The deeper issue is not discipline, it is the default behavior. Until defaults change, effort is spent fighting oneself. Nightingale believed that clarity dissolves this conflict. When someone realizes that many of their decisions are not decisions at all, they stop blaming themselves. They stop moralizing the problem. Instead, they begin to observe. They notice how quickly they dismiss certain ideas. They notice which options never feel realistic. They notice which risks feel intolerable without a clear reason. These observations are not meant to judge, they are meant to reveal. Once revealed, automation loses some of its authority. It is no longer mistaken for truth. It is recognized as a habit. And habit, unlike fate, can be reconditioned, but this requires patience. Automatic responses were not created in a day. They were built through years of repetition. Expecting them to disappear through insight alone is another form of impatience. Nightingale warned against this as well. Awareness opens the door, repetition walks through it. The goal is not to force new decisions, it is to introduce new inputs often enough that different reactions become possible. Only then do choices expand. Until that happens, most financial decisions will continue to be made without being decided. They will feel personal, justified, and inevitable. And the pattern will continue, not because of external limitation, but because the same internal commands are still being executed. Understanding this does not instantly change behavior, but it does something equally important. It returns control to the right level. Not to effort, not to motivation, but to the quiet repetition that has been deciding all along. That is where real change begins. Chapter 5. How Conditioning is Installed. Most people assume their financial thinking was formed through conscious choice, that they examined ideas about money, weighed evidence, and arrived at conclusions. Earl Nightingale rejected this assumption entirely. He understood that conditioning is not chosen, it is absorbed. The mind does not wait for adulthood to begin forming patterns. It starts early, long before logic develops. Long before someone earns money, they learn how to feel about it. Tension, caution, envy, relief, pride. These emotions attach themselves to money before meaning does. What is repeated with emotion becomes durable. Children do not learn financial behavior from explanations. They learn it from observation. What they see reacts to. What causes stress? What is argued about? What is avoided? What is admired? These impressions are not analyzed. They are recorded. By the time reasoning arrives, the recording is already playing. Nightingale emphasized that repetition from authority carries disproportionate weight. Parents, teachers, culture, and early environments supply the first scripts. These scripts do not sound like rules, they sound like reality. Statements such as, "People like us don't do that," or "that's risky," or "money changes people," are not evaluated for accuracy. They are stored as orientation points. The mind does not ask whether these ideas are true. It asks whether they are familiar. Familiarity is what determines credibility at the subconscious level. This is why later financial education often fails. New ideas conflict with deeply installed orientations. The person understands the logic, but the internal response remains unchanged. The old pattern has seniority. Nightingale also observed that emotional repetition is more powerful than verbal repetition. A single emotionally charged experience can outweigh dozens of neutral explanations. This explains why people who grew up around financial instability often react strongly to uncertainty even when their current situation is stable. The conditioning was formed under pressure. The mind learned to associate money with threat. Once that association is installed, it persists until deliberately replaced. Conditioning is reinforced not only by repetition but by reinforcement. When a behavior produces emotional relief, it is strengthened. Avoiding risk reduces anxiety. Staying within limits reduces uncertainty. The mind learns that these behaviors are protective. Protection feels intelligent, it feels responsible, it feels mature. But protection can also become confinement. Nightingale never accused people of being irrational. He pointed out that their behavior made perfect sense given the conditioning they had received. The mistake was assuming that sense-making equaled truth. Conditioning also spreads socially. People absorb norms from peers without realizing it. What is considered acceptable, ambitious, greedy, unrealistic, or dangerous is often defined by group behavior. Standing outside those norms triggers discomfort. Not because the behavior is wrong, but because it threatens belonging. The mind prioritizes belonging over expansion. This is another reason financial patterns persist. Change is not only internal, it is relational. When someone begins to think differently, they often feel subtle social friction. They downplay it, they rationalize it, they retreat. The conditioning wins again. Nightingale understood that these forces operate quietly. There is no dramatic moment where beliefs are installed. There is only repetition. Over time, repetition becomes an assumption. Assumption becomes expectation. Expectation becomes behavior. This chain does not require conscious approval. This is why people often say, "That's just how I am with money." They confuse conditioning with identity. Identity feels permanent. Conditioning is not. But until it is recognized as conditioning, it remains invisible. Nightingale warned that people often protect their conditioning because it feels like self-protection. Challenging it feels destabilizing. It raises questions that have been avoided for years. Questions such as, why does this feel unsafe? Where did this expectation come from? Who taught me this was normal? Most people never ask these questions. They stay busy. They stay distracted. They stay within known limits. This is not laziness. It is efficiency. The mind prefers predictable discomfort over unpredictable possibility. Understanding how conditioning is installed removes shame from the process. You did not design it. You inherited it, absorbed it, rehearsed it. But inheritance does not mean obligation. Nightingale believed that once someone sees conditioning as a mechanism rather than a personal truth, responsibility shifts, not to blame, but to maintenance. You cannot remove what you do not acknowledge, and you cannot replace what you do not observe. This section of the work is not about fixing anything. It is about tracing patterns back to their source. Because once you understand how conditioning was installed, you stop arguing with it. You stop fighting yourself. You begin to work at the correct level, not with force, not with motivation, but with deliberate, repeated input. That is how conditioning was built, and that is how it is changed, slowly, quietly, without drama. This is the part most people skip. And it is why most people repeat the same results. Understanding installation is the beginning of interruption, and interruption is the first real sign that the pattern can change. Chapter 6. The delay that traps most people. One of the most overlooked elements in financial change is time. Not long-term time, but delayed time. The gap between internal change and external evidence. Earl Nightingale warned repeatedly about this gap because it is where most people abandon the process, not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret what the delay means. When thinking changes, results do not respond immediately. Behavior shifts first, often subtly. Decisions feel slightly different, reactions soften, priorities reorder. None of this looks like progress when measured financially, so people conclude that nothing is happening. This conclusion feels logical. It is also incorrect. The delay exists because results lag behind behavior, and behavior lags behind thinking. The mind adjusts before the environment does. This creates a period where effort feels disconnected from outcome. Most people cannot tolerate this phase. They expect feedback. When feedback does not arrive quickly, they assume the old way was more reliable. Familiar struggle feels more trustworthy than unfamiliar neutrality. This is the moment where repetition reasserts itself. People return to old thinking not because it was better, but because it was proven. The new thinking has not yet demonstrated its value externally, so it feels risky to continue. Nightingale saw this as the most dangerous point in the process, not because failure occurs here, but because reversal does. Reversal feels like relief. The tension of waiting disappears. Certainty returns. The person tells themselves a story about realism, timing, or priorities. The internal reference point re-establishes control. The tragedy is that reversal often occurs just before change would have compounded. Internal recalibration does not produce dramatic signals. It produces neutrality, less emotional charge, less urgency, less reaction. This calm is often misread as stagnation, but calm is not stagnation. It is stability forming. Nightingale emphasized patience, but not optimism. He did not suggest waiting with hope. He suggested continuing with discipline, regardless of feeling. This is difficult because the delay removes emotional reinforcement. There is no excitement, no validation, no reassurance, just consistency. Most people are not trained for this. They expect progress to feel like momentum. When it feels like quiet repetition, they assume they are doing it wrong. This assumption resets the pattern. The delay also exposes dependency on motivation. When results do not reward effort immediately, motivation fades, conditioning resumes, old habits return. This is why financial change often appears impossible. People rarely stay with new thinking long enough for behavior to reorganize fully. Nightingale understood that the mind tests new patterns. It looks for evidence. When none appears quickly, it withdraws support. This is not sabotage, it is efficiency. The mind conserves energy by abandoning unproven strategies. Understanding this reframes the delay. The delay is not punishment. It is verification time. During this period, the internal system is being rewritten. Old reactions are weakening. New interpretations are being rehearsed. None of this is visible externally. People who succeed do not eliminate the delay. They endure it without interpretation. They do not ask whether it is working. They continue because the repetition itself is the work. This is where Nightingale's thinking diverged sharply from popular motivation. He did not promise quick results. He warned against expecting them. He observed that people who escape financial ceilings do so quietly. There is no moment of arrival. There is a gradual disappearance of old reactions. By the time results appear, the internal change has already stabilized. Most people never reach this point. They exit during the delay and reinforce the belief that change is unreliable. The delay is not the problem. The interpretation of the delay is. When the delay is seen as failure, reversal occurs. When it is seen as a process, continuation becomes possible. Nightingale believed this distinction explained the difference between those who break patterns and those who repeat them indefinitely. The delay separates intention from conditioning. It reveals whether repetition is strong enough to persist without reward. This is the phase that feels empty, directionless, unimpressive. It is also the phase where structure replaces emotion. Once behavior stabilizes at a new level, results eventually follow, not dramatically, incrementally, often unnoticed at first. By then, the person no longer needs proof. The new pattern is already normal. This is why Nightingale insisted that patience was not passive. It was active endurance of repetition without feedback. Most people fail here not because they lack ability, but because they mistake silence for absence. The delay is not a signal to stop. It is the signal that the system is reorganizing. Those who understand this pass through it. Those who don't return to what feels safe, and the pattern continues. Chapter 7. Signs the pattern is actually breaking. Most people expect change to announce itself. A breakthrough, a sudden increase, a visible shift they can point to and say, "This is it." Earl Nightingale understood that this expectation is precisely why most people miss the moment when change actually begins. When financial patterns start to break, the signs are subtle. They do not look like success. They look neutral. The first sign is not excitement. It is a reduction in emotional noise. Money stops triggering the same intensity it once did. Decisions feel quieter, less charged, less urgent. This calm is often mistaken for a lack of ambition. It isn't. It is the nervous system releasing its grip. When conditioning weakens, the body no longer reacts as strongly. Old fears do not disappear, but they lose volume. The mind pauses where it once rushed. That pause is critical. It is the space where new behavior becomes possible. Another sign is a change in questions. People stop asking, "What if this goes wrong?" and begin asking, "What would this require?" The shift is small but decisive. One question shuts down action. The other opens an evaluation. This does not happen because confidence suddenly appears. It happens because repetition has altered interpretation. The same situation is now processed through a different filter. Nightingale paid close attention to this. He noticed that people whose patterns were changing began to evaluate rather than react. They did not become bolder, they became clearer. Clarity is often misread as hesitation. It is not. It is the absence of panic. Another sign is pacing. People stop rushing financial decisions. They no longer feel compelled to act quickly to relieve discomfort. They are willing to wait without anxiety. This patience is not discipline, it is a lack of internal pressure. Pressure is the hallmark of old conditioning. When the internal reference point begins to shift, urgency fades. The person does not need immediate resolution. They can hold uncertainty without collapsing into old habits. This is uncomfortable at first. The absence of pressure can feel like emptiness. People who are used to constant financial stress often confuse calm with stagnation. Nightingale warned against this misinterpretation. Calm is not inactivity. It is stability forming. Another indicator is tolerance for unfamiliar outcomes. Opportunities that once felt unrealistic no longer trigger immediate rejection. The person does not say yes automatically. They also do not say no automatically. They consider. Consideration is new territory for conditioned thinking. Previously, the answer arrived instantly. Now there is a pause. That pause signals that automation is loosening its grip. People often overlook this because it does not feel dramatic. There is no rush of courage, no surge of belief, just a quiet sense that something is no longer off limits. This is the moment when people are most likely to sabotage themselves by seeking confirmation. They look for proof in numbers. When none appears yet, they question the process. Nightingale would have recognized this as impatience disguised as realism. Internal change does not need external validation to continue. In fact, seeking validation too early can restore old patterns. The person begins scanning for results instead of continuing repetition. Another sign the pattern is breaking is reduced self-justification. People stop explaining their financial position as much. They no longer rehearse reasons, not because the reasons disappeared, but because they lost relevance. Explanation is often a defense mechanism. When behavior changes, the need for defense diminishes. This is uncomfortable socially. Others may not understand the shift. The person seems quieter, less reactive, less interested in proving anything. Nightingale saw this as a hallmark of genuine progress. The need to persuade others declines when internal coherence increases. A further sign is selective effort. Instead of doing more, people begin doing less, but with precision. They drop activities that maintain motion without direction. This can look like laziness to outsiders. It is not. It is discrimination. Old conditioning rewards busyness. New conditioning rewards alignment. The difference is visible only over time. People often worry at this stage that they are losing momentum. In reality, they are shedding noise. Another subtle indicator is discomfort with old conversations. Discussions that revolve around complaint, fear, or limitation begin to feel draining, not offensive. Draining. The mind no longer resonates with the repetition it is attempting to replace. This can create temporary isolation. People may feel out of sync with their environment. Nightingale recognized this as transitional, not permanent. The environment does not change immediately, the person does. This mismatch can be misinterpreted as regression. It is not, it is realignment. Perhaps the clearest sign is this: the person stops asking whether they deserve more. The question disappears, not because it was answered, but because it was irrelevant. Deserving is a moral frame. Conditioning operates mechanically. When the frame changes, the question dissolves. Nightingale emphasized that financial progress does not begin with believing you deserve more. It begins with behaving as if more is permissible. Permission precedes justification. When permission shifts, behavior adjusts quietly. No announcement, no declaration. This is why most people miss it. They are waiting for confidence, excitement, or certainty. What arrives instead is neutrality. Neutrality is not indifference, it is the absence of resistance. And resistance is what maintained the pattern. At this stage, many people sabotage themselves by reintroducing urgency. They set arbitrary deadlines, they demand results, they revive pressure to feel productive. This pressure reactivates old conditioning. Nightingale warned against this reflex. He advised continuing repetition without demanding proof. Proof arrives after stabilization, not before. The signs that matter most are internal and boring: less reaction, more pause, fewer justifications, quieter decisions. These are not symptoms of failure. They are evidence that automation is weakening. The pattern does not break loudly, it dissolves. By the time financial results reflect the change, the internal shift is already complete. The person no longer feels surprised. The outcome feels earned, but not dramatic. This is why those who change rarely talk about it while it's happening. There is nothing to report. The work is internal. The evidence comes later. And if you are waiting for excitement to confirm progress, you will miss the moment when progress actually begins. Chapter 8. Why most people never do this work. Once the mechanics are understood, a difficult question emerges. If financial patterns operate this predictably, why don't more people change them? Earl Nightingale's answer was not a lack of intelligence, opportunity, or information. It was avoidance. Most people never do this work because it requires sustained attention to something invisible, and the mind is conditioned to focus on what produces immediate feedback. Internal repetition offers none. There is no applause for examining assumptions, no social reward for questioning what feels normal, no visible marker of progress when conditioning begins to loosen. From the outside, nothing appears to be happening. This makes the work easy to abandon and hard to justify. People prefer visible struggle to invisible recalibration. Struggle can be explained, recalibration cannot. Nightingale observed that people are far more comfortable changing circumstances than examining interpretation. Circumstances feel external. Interpretation feels personal. Challenging interpretation threatens identity. This threat is subtle. It does not appear as fear. It appears as disinterest, distraction, or fatigue. The mind redirects attention toward tasks that feel productive. Busyness becomes a defense. People say they don't have time to think differently. What they mean is that thinking differently produces no immediate reward while staying busy does. There is also the problem of social friction. Internal change often creates quiet separation. When someone stops repeating the same assumptions, conversations feel misaligned. Familiar complaints lose their appeal. Shared frustrations no longer bond. This creates a sense of distance. Most people prefer belonging over clarity. They unconsciously choose repetition that preserves social alignment. Nightingale understood this and never framed independent thinking as popular. He framed it as rare. Another reason people avoid this work is that it removes comforting explanations. Blaming circumstances, systems, or luck provides emotional relief. It preserves the idea that change is out of one's control. Once repetition is identified as the cause, relief disappears. Responsibility becomes mechanical, not moral, but it is still responsibility. This is uncomfortable. People often say they want control, but what they want is reassurance. Control requires maintenance. Reassurance requires agreement. Internal recalibration offers no reassurance. It only offers cause and effect. Nightingale noticed that people often reject ideas that remove excuses, even when those ideas empower them. Excuses may limit progress, but they protect self-image. Doing this work means letting go of the story that one has been unlucky, overlooked, or unfairly constrained. Even if that story is partially true, repeating it reinforces the same outcomes. Letting it go feels like a loss. There is also the issue of boredom. Repetition is not exciting. The mind craves novelty. New strategies, new methods, new promises. Quiet repetition feels dull in comparison. This is why people constantly seek new information while ignoring implementation. New ideas stimulate. Old work stabilizes. Nightingale warned that people often mistake stimulation for progress. They collect insights and confuse understanding with change. Change does not occur at the level of insight. It occurs at the level of repetition. Another barrier is impatience. The delay discussed earlier feels intolerable to many people. Without immediate feedback, they assume the process is flawed. They return to old patterns because old patterns at least respond quickly. Even negative results feel more predictable than delayed improvement. Predictability feels safe. This is why most people never escape financial ranges, not because they cannot, but because they refuse to remain in the uncomfortable middle where old patterns are weakening and new ones are not yet visible. This middle produces no identity. You are no longer who you were, but not yet who you will be. The mind dislikes this ambiguity, so it resolves it by reverting. Nightingale understood that those who do change are not extraordinary. They are simply willing to tolerate invisibility longer than others. They accept that progress does not announce itself, that repetition feels unrewarding, that no one notices. They continue anyway. This willingness is rare, not heroic, rare. Most people stop because there is nothing to hold on to, no proof, no encouragement, no validation, just quiet consistency. This is why the majority repeat the same financial outcomes throughout life. Not because they are incapable, but because the work required to change patterns offers no short-term compensation. It demands patience without optimism, effort without drama, repetition without excitement. Nightingale never framed this as a flaw in humanity. He framed it as a description. Most people prefer the certainty of known limitations to the uncertainty of internal change. Those who do not make that choice eventually separate themselves, not by ambition, but by consistency. They stop trying to feel different. They stop trying to prove anything. They simply repeat new inputs long enough for behavior to reorganize. And when results finally shift, it looks accidental to everyone else. This is why most people never do this work. And why do those who do rarely talk about it? They don't need to. The change has already stabilized. Chapter 9. The Silent Advantage. When internal patterns finally stabilize, something unexpected happens. The struggle disappears, not because effort is no longer required, but because effort is no longer misdirected. Earl Nightingale referred to this as the quiet advantage. Not an advantage that draws attention, but one that compounds unnoticed. From the outside, nothing dramatic has changed. From the inside, resistance fades. People often imagine that financial progress feels like acceleration. In reality, it feels like simplification. Decisions require less emotional energy. There is less second-guessing, fewer internal debates. The mind no longer argues with itself before acting. Behavior flows from structure instead of pressure. This is what most people misinterpret as confidence. It is not confidence, it is alignment. When conditioning supports direction, action feels ordinary, not brave, not risky, just appropriate. Nightingale observed that people with this alignment rarely describe themselves as motivated. Motivation implies resistance. These individuals experience continuity instead. What they do today resembles what they will do tomorrow. This continuity is the real advantage. Because behavior no longer fluctuates with mood, results become predictable. Predictability allows planning. Planning allows leverage. Leverage allows growth without strain. From the outside, it can appear that these individuals are doing less. They are not chasing every opportunity. They are not reacting to every fluctuation. They are selective. Selectivity is misunderstood as passivity. In reality, selectivity is efficiency. Old conditioning pushes people to overextend, to say yes reflexively, to pursue movement instead of direction. New conditioning allows refusal without guilt. This refusal protects energy. It prevents regression. It maintains coherence. Another aspect of the silent advantage is reduced urgency. Urgency is often mistaken for ambition. Nightingale understood urgency as a symptom of instability. When the internal reference point is unsettled, everything feels time-sensitive. When it stabilizes, urgency fades. This does not mean complacency. It means decisions are made on structure rather than fear. The future is no longer treated as a threat that must be outrun. People often worry that losing urgency will reduce progress. The opposite is true. Progress becomes sustainable. Sustainability is what allows compounding. Nightingale rarely spoke about compounding in financial terms alone. He spoke about behavioral compounding. Small, consistent actions repeated without resistance accumulate quietly. This accumulation attracts little attention. There is no story to tell, no dramatic pivot, no visible breakthrough. That is why the advantage remains silent. Those who possess it are rarely admired early. They do not signal ambition. They do not advertise effort. They simply proceed. Over time, the difference becomes visible, not because they tried harder, but because they stopped oscillating. Most people live in oscillation. They surge and retreat. They commit and abandon. Their results mirror this pattern. The silent advantage removes oscillation. Once behavior stabilizes, external volatility becomes less disruptive. Market changes, setbacks, and delays are absorbed without emotional overreaction. The system holds. This is what allows long-term thinking. Nightingale believed that long-term thinking was not a personality trait. It was a consequence of internal order. When the mind is no longer consumed by internal conflict, it can extend its horizon. This is why those who change patterns often appear patient. They are not waiting, they are continuing. Waiting implies anticipation. Continuing implies structure. Another misunderstood aspect of the silent advantage is the disappearance of self-comparison. When internal metrics replace external validation, the need to measure oneself against others declines. This is not humility, it is irrelevant. Others' progress no longer threatens or inspires, it simply exists. The individual is no longer competing for identity. This reduces distraction. Attention returns to the process. Nightingale understood that attention is finite. When it is no longer consumed by internal resistance, it becomes available for execution. Execution without resistance looks effortless. It isn't. It is simply unobstructed. This is why the silent advantage is often mistaken for luck. Observers see outcomes without seeing the years of repetition that removed friction. They assume something external caused the change. The truth is less interesting and more useful. Internal repetition stabilized, behavior followed, results accumulated. There was no moment of arrival. By the time financial outcomes clearly reflect the change, the person has already moved on psychologically. The result feels expected, it feels normal. This is the final confirmation that the reference point has shifted. When success no longer feels surprising, it has become structural. That is the silent advantage Earl Nightingale described, not louder ambition, not a greater effort, but quieter resistance. And once resistance disappears, progress stops needing encouragement. It proceeds on its own. Conclusion. Earl Nightingale never claimed that financial results respond to desire, effort, or motivation. He observed something far simpler and far more difficult to accept. Results follow repetition. What you think about occasionally does not matter. What you return to daily does. Most people spend their lives trying to change outcomes while leaving their internal patterns untouched. They work harder, learn more, and stay busy, only to arrive at the same place again. Not because they failed, because nothing upstream changed. This audiobook was not meant to inspire you, it was meant to clarify. Once repetition is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once it is seen, responsibility shifts from effort to awareness. You do not need to fight your circumstances. You need to notice what you have been rehearsing. Change begins quietly, long before numbers move. It begins when familiar thoughts are no longer accepted automatically, when reactions pause, when old limits stop feeling inevitable. That is where repetition starts to break. And when repetition changes, results follow, not dramatically, not instantly, but permanently. Nothing more is required.